The bogeyman of Brexit, the man who detests Brexit and everything it stands for. So he became Prime Minister and he tried forcing through a budget, which was, it made Rachel Reeves's budget look like a land of milk and honey.
So we've had missions, we've had first steps, and today we've got milestones. Keir Starmer is setting out his plan for change and sort of setting out what the government's going to talk about for the next few years. We're going to get into that on the Division Bell. I'm Lizzy Buchan, and I've got Calgie with me again. Hello.
Hello. Looking forward to it. Let's do it. Right, Lizzy, quick. Name the new 5 milestones, missions, whatever Starmer's new term is. What's the speech announcing today?
Oh God, naming the missions. Keir Starmer's been talking about the missions for a long time. I think that I can do them. I'm going to try. Clean energy, superpower, safer streets, NHS, opportunities and growth, which, considering it's my full-time job to write about these things, probably tells you that maybe the public aren't quite hearing it. So I think there's been a feeling in number 10, sort of more broadly across government, that they really need to kind of turn the missions, which was Keir Starmer's kind of the crux of his politics, of his idea for government, into something that's a bit more tangible. So they've spent a few months working on this idea for a plan for change, which the PM is setting out today. We're recording in the morning, so he's speaking a little bit after we've recorded this. But a lot of it's been heavily trailed this week, hasn't it?
It has, which, on the one hand gives Keir Starmer a lot more media coverage. On the other, it makes a boring speech even more, unnewsworthy. And I think really the word that they're focusing on is sort of retail, isn't it? It's that ironically political jargon that implies that Labour understand that they haven't really had a story to tell, and a lot of voters don't really understand what the purpose of the government is, and also by what metrics we will be able to judge the government on at the next election. Now, we had a poll, didn't we, on both the Express and the Mirror, asking whether the government needs a reset. Unsurprisingly, Express readers 74% yes, 26% no. I can only assume that those 26% of people don't want a reset because they're quite happy with the ongoing implosion. They'd like it to remain that way. What was it for the Mirror?
50-50.
It's interesting.
Yeah, which I think shows you perhaps why the government thinks that they need to do this speech, which is absolutely, definitely not a reset, according to Downing Street. I think there's something interesting there because Keir Starmer has set out kind of what he stands for in his mind a number of times, but it doesn't seem to be quite, like you say, coalescing into a clear narrative, a clear vision that people can understand. And I think there's a danger here, which I've kind of spoken to a few people about in government, of repeating some of the mistakes that Rishi Sunak made, which was that this idea that if you just get on with the job and you work hard and you deliver stuff, that the voters will thank you for it. And what's interesting is that they won't, unless they really feel that their lives are better. And if you don't give people a sense of hope, a sort of idea of where the country's heading, they're going to lose interest, they're going to lose confidence. And I think this is what the government's attempting to do, is to kind of colour in some of the picture to show people what Britain can be like at the next election, because these new sort of milestones that the government wants to hit are all sort of for 2029.
Yeah.
But they sound like they're going to be quite tough targets, and I wonder whether maybe they're creating hostages to fortune.
They will be tough targets. And obviously Rishi is a good comparison because he had his 5 missions. Of course, did he meet 2 or 3 of them on inflation and a couple of the economic metrics?
Yeah, one was totally cheating. He said, "Oh, we're going to halve inflation," which was going to happen anyway and was nothing to do with
incredibly
him.
successful Prime Minister.
But then the other one was stop the boats.
Stop the boats, of course.
Which he never got anywhere near.
No, he didn't. Although during the leadership election, it was introduced legislation to stop the boats. Much more achievable, which he did. But then he got into government, and it became a promise to stop the boats, even though everyone knew it was never going to happen. But and also I think Joe Biden will be prominent in the minds of Labour because, of course, he actually did oversee very high growth during his presidency, and it clearly didn't work for the Democrats. People weren't feeling it. So yes, it's an opportunity for Labour to try and go from civil service mode to politician mode. Obviously, critics will point out 2 things, which are firstly that we have had, whether the government considers them resets or not, there have been a lot of stop-start moments. I mean, especially around Sue Gray's departure, that was considered a reset. There were a number of moments very early on when they were like, okay, we need to get the show back on the road. And also, for me, ultimately, I think the problem is always going to be Keir Starmer because, it almost reminds me of when Boris's supporters were saying, look, we need a new chief of staff and director of comms, we need a new team in Downing Street. And, at the end of the day, a leopard can't change its spots. And Keir Starmer put out a tweet this morning which said, I wrote it down, we were elected with a mandate for change. The next phase of mission-led government continues our relentless focus on delivery for working people. It's so, it's so unrelentingly civil servant speak. It's not emotional, is it?
It's interesting that I've been wondering what it is about sort of mission-led government, things like, these phrases that he keeps using, fixing the foundations, all of that. They clearly think that this is something they need to hammer home to voters, that voters are going to understand it and they're going to seize on it and accept that this is a good idea. But I wonder whether it is a bit slightly jargony. I mean, I think a lot of what's easy to get lost in some of this stuff is the ideas are good. Like, the 5 missions are the things that people care about. The NHS, crime, schools, energy bills, living standards. These are things that people care about. They've identified the right stuff. They just need to find a way to sell it. And I think they're trying to be bold. The PM's trying to say, look, here's how you can hold me to account on, in the hope of kind of rebuilding a sort of trust around the idea that a lot of promises have been made to voters in recent years that haven't been kept, whether the politician themselves intended to or not. I mean, Boris made loads of promises that I'm not sure he ever intended to keep. But, Rishi Sunak made his 5 pledges. What was interesting is that was back in January 2023. I remember him and Keir Starmer both did speeches in exactly the same sort of street in Stratford in the same week. I went to both of them, and there was the Sunak pledges and the Starmer missions.
Yes.
And we all speculated that Sunak had done it just because he'd found out that Starmer was doing it, so he got in first and did it 2 days earlier. But Sunak's weren't really successful, but Starmer is sticking to his guns here. And so I think they do need a bit more humanity in this, a bit more of kind of, because I think Starmer as a person, he can make very good speeches. He can be very good on the doorstep. He can be very personable. He's interested in people. I've seen him on visits. I've interviewed him many times over the years. He is nowhere near as perhaps, I don't know, sort of loyally as he can appear in these. And I don't think they need to find a way to harness that.
But ultimately, I think Starmerism is about, in its essence, it is about putting delivery ahead of presentation. Really, that's Starmer's
fair.
whole thing, right? So actually, when it comes to the next election in 2029, will we remember the difference between the missions, the steps, the milestones, the foundations? No, of course we won't. But Starmer's desperate hope is that people feel better off. And that's why I think there's a consensus across most politics, especially I know my contacts on the right and in the Tory party, they'd accept that GDP is largely irrelevant. It's sort of GDP per capita or whether people feel better off, whether they have more disposable income. I think largely that sort of shift in emphasis is a necessity in government, because people clearly haven't been feeling better off.
Yeah, so the original pledge was to have the highest growth in the G7, which I think they now seem to be shifting towards living standards. I think that's a good idea.
It's also because I don't think the OBR say they're not going to get the highest GDP growth in the G7.
I think that's probably part of it. But also, who knows what that means? If we've got the highest growth in the G7, but half the country is totally left behind and are struggling day to day, that's not going to count for anything. And so, it's more about thinking about the kind of personal, about how people's day-to-day lives are going to be improving. And Starmer can be very good on this. I always liked there was a period of time where he talked about kind of ordinary hope, about giving people the things that just make life worth living. Have you got enough money left over at the end of the week that you can go to the pub and see your friends, or go to the cinema, get a takeaway? The stuff, can you go on holiday? The stuff that makes life not just like a daily grind. And I slightly wish that they would lean in a bit more to that sort of thing, because they lent so heavily ahead of the budget into the doom and gloom.
Yes.
And
sort of backfired as well.
It's been very gloomy. And, it's been a tough few years for the country. Post-pandemic, we also had the riots in the summer. There's been a lot of really difficult stuff. You could see people want to feel hopeful. The government needs to find a way to do that.
There's a desire for change, and whether it's hope or whether it's anger really is in Starmer's hands come 2029, I think. But,
that's a good point.
there's an Ipsos poll today, 53% say disappointed with the Labour government so far. We look forward to seeing whether today's speech, the 6 milestones, starts shifting that from your perspective, the right direction.
So while all the attention mostly this week has been on the kind of plan for change, what the government's up to, the lesser spotted Tories are sort of getting on with business, getting used to life in opposition. I'm not sure how much attention I've been paying. So, Christian, how's Kemi getting on?
Well, I think it's very interesting at this point, into her premiership, to sort of take a pause and look at how the Tories are doing, because not only are Labour just more interesting, and obviously there's so many more MPs that it's easier to find disagreements and infighting and all the rest of it in Downing Street and in Parliament, but also from the right, it is sometimes more interesting with reform. They're on the up. Their polling is still improving. They've had in the last week they've had a couple of Tory defections, former MP and quite a well-known Tory columnist. So it's easy to ignore, and that is the problem. That really is, Kemi and the rest of her team know that all too well, that other than PMQs, where it's a real sort of make or break moment every Wednesday, they need to work out how to get voters' attention. Clearly it's not going appallingly. You know, we have had a couple of polls where they're ahead.
Resounding sort of endorsement.
No. You know, it will. It's like trying to get a lorry up to full speed from a standing start, isn't it? It will go slowly at first, and she needs to try and build that momentum. And actually, I've been really enjoying Prime Minister's questions for the last few weeks, not just because of Kemi, but I actually think her and Starmer are really interesting adversaries, and it also helps that they clearly loathe each other.
Makes it quite fun.
And that makes it more entertaining. Now she's off to the States today for a sort of right-wing conference. I know she's got some sort of pipe dreams about meeting Donald Trump. I'd be astonished if she pulled that off. She'd need friends in very high places for that. But clearly, she still feels like she's new on the world stage. I mean, let's be honest. I think most Brits. I do still think Kemi is a bit of a Westminster phenomenon. You know, in the 22 Tory leadership election, and then again, her versus Jenrick. I mean, it was so Westminster insider.
Yeah.
You know, I felt there was no cut through. But clearly, focus groups throughout that election were saying she seems fresh. They wanted to hear more about her, what she's got to say. And she did the speech on immigration. I think really Kemi, at the moment, she does need to start giving us an idea about what she stands for. That is her sort of big big mission at the moment. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think Starmer's remotely sort of scared at this point?
Not really. I mean, I don't say that to be disrespectful to her in the sense that, but opposition is hard. Labour found that. Everyone finds that. You suddenly lose all of the oxygen that was given to you, and they've got to find a way to make a difference. And to be honest, most of the time, I think most people only see her really at PMQs. The rest of the time, they're not really featuring. And I think that I agree with you about the Westminster phenomenon, because I think that she's had a number of like quite senior government roles, but often things that are perhaps not very like public facing, like international trade or business, which are, things that perhaps an ordinary person on the street isn't keeping an eye on all the time. And so, she only really tended to kind of come to the fore when she'd said something
controversial.
Mad. Yeah.
Controversial.
So, she likes to pick a fight. We know that. Yeah. But as opposition leader, that's quite difficult. That can't be your strategy all the time. And I think you're right that, again, Nigel Farage remains interesting to people and has a huge sort of wider interest outside of Parliament. So that's quite hard for her to combat.
Yeah.
He's taking up all this oxygen on the right of the party. And I mean, we've talked about needing to know what Starmer stands for. I have no idea what Kemi stands for. Do you?
I think that was clearly a criticism levelled at her by Robert Jenrick's campaign. And she insisted, of course, that actually the priority was trying to bring the party together and then working out policy from that moment on. I mean,
does she just not have anything to say? Was she just buying time?
I think she has firm views on areas that interest her. That's always been, Kemi is. I always heard stories, from when she was in government about sort of, she had a role that was, business and trade. Very interested, hyper interested in certain parts, but then there were also areas that just she had no interest in. And that really is the problem as leader, is that you do have to be interested in everything. You've got to be as interested in international trade and, say, the culture wars, of course, that's one of Kemi's big selling points, as you do education reform or, early life welfare for children. That really for Kemi is... I know she wants to be consensus and bring the party together, but it's such a small party. That's the thing that's always worth remarking on, is that, compared to Labour in 2019, yes, it was the worst since 83, but there are 200 MPs. That's 80 more. There's such a big and massive MPs. You've got MPs doubling up in the shadow cabinet as whips and spokespeople for departments. And again, compare it to 97, you didn't have that reform threat, which is still, I think the local elections, unfortunately for Kemi, and I don't think this has been talked about much, the local elections are going to be really bad. Not because of Kemi, but just, of course, when were they last voted on? I think it was 2021. Or 2020, they were really good years for the party. And so they're starting at a high watermark.
And they
can only go down. So actually, even though Labour have, fallen quite far since the election in terms of popularity, I think relatively they're going to come out looking quite well. Reform, I think they're on course for, an incredible showing, possibly. They may even win a mayoralty in Lincolnshire with Andrea Jenkins. I think I was speaking to a Tory last night and said, genuinely that is a possibility.
Delighted to see her defecting. My main memory of her is her showing her middle finger to protesters outside Downing Street when Boris resigned.
That was it. I was on TV News with her last week for 2 hours, at which point halfway through she revealed she was in a rock band in her 30s, all of the songs of which are available on her website. When none of us had ever spotted that gem of a story.
I can't believe I've missed that.
So Kemi needs to book her ideas up and get in a band, I think. So I just think it's one to watch. It's very interesting, but her PMQs, they're feisty. They're interesting. They're what I want to see. So yeah, she just, I think, needs to get a move on with starting to do some more policy at this point.
I've been really enjoying after Prime Minister's questions, journalists always do a huddle, don't we? Where the Prime Minister's official spokesman and his political press secretary will come and do a briefing, and then afterwards the opposition will do it. So they've obviously swapped since the election, and I've been really enjoying these recently because Kemi's spokesman will always come up and have to slightly correct something she said, or try and defend something. I mean, I enjoyed yesterday's exchange was quite interesting because she went in very punchily about the resignation of
Louise
Transport
Haigh,
Secretary Louise Haigh, with this sort of line about politicians. I can't remember the exact line.
We need more convicted politicians and not politicians with convictions.
Exactly.
Great line.
Which is quite a good line. And the PM came back and sort of said, oh, well, her predecessors, remembers that her predecessors had convictions,
yeah.
Which is slightly cheeky because Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson were both fined by police for breaking the COVID rules, but
technically a conviction.
Fixed penalty, but it's not really a conviction. But then we won't get into the weeds of it, but Louise Haig's pleaded guilty to a fraud offence over a mobile phone theft in 2014, which is a spent conviction. So there's a lot of kind of grey area here.
But they were still battling behind the scenes, weren't they? And we had a Labour source say, if they want to have an argument about the level of criminality at Downing Street,
really punchy.
I thought that was very good because that's sort of quite vote leave, isn't it? That is like the 350 million on the bus. That's like, it's not technically correct, but if you want to have the argument, then we're willing to underline that and point it out to the government, to the country. I thought that was a flare of political nous from Labour that is quite missing often.
Definitely, and it's good to it's a good row for them to have because obviously, Partygate, the pandemic, all still looms large in people's minds. So, I think it's good to remind people of that. And I was delighted to see Boris Johnson wading in, saying that Keir Starmer should correct the record. The same Boris Johnson who was about to be handed a 90-day suspension from Parliament for misleading MPs over Partygate, but then resigned in a strop, so he didn't have to have the suspension. Delicious. Loved it.
There we are. We've gone from Kemi to Farage to Starmer to Boris. And I think if that doesn't underline the issue she may have, that there are more interesting people to talk about, then I don't know what does. But I'm sure she'll be working hard to change that. Right, time for Moment of the Week. What's yours?
So it feels like it was quite a long time ago, but I think it has to be the assisted dying vote on Friday. Obviously, MPs voted to give the legislation second reading, so it's now starting its kind of parliamentary stage, going through line-by-line scrutiny. It'll be back in the Commons, we think, next year. So there's a long way to go on before you could ever see an assisted dying service. But I really felt like I've never seen a vote like that I've been in Parliament 8 years, on a kind of matter of conscience that MPs had really wrestled with. You could see the debate was really good. Like, people really had spent a lot of time thinking about what they wanted to do. Some incredibly sad and moving stories, from people on both sides of the debate. And when they read the result, it was total silence, which again is really, really unusual. So yeah, I felt like that was a real moment of just societal change, because if you think about the fact 2015, there was a similar bill fell, and so I think it shows something about Britain today, which was very interesting. It
was, and I know it's an argument that a lot on the right were making pejoratively, but it sort of was the case that, those MPs, after passing that bill, they did sort of exit the chamber into a different world. Our relationship with the state, with healthcare, with those decisions of life or death and human autonomy and all the rest of it, it sort of changed. And it's, fair play to Kim Ledbetter. I mean, that's a tough bill. It's a tough bill and a hell of a legacy, and I say this entirely complimentary and everything. I don't want to be misconstrued, but she is no longer just the sister of Jo Cox. She is a formidable politician in her own right, and she's secured that, provided that this continues to go through. And I know there's some debate about whether some MPs were like, well, they'll withdraw their support if enough changes aren't made. I have a feeling that not enough. I mean, maybe 2 or 3, but not the 20 or 30 that's needed to change the sizable lead that she has. So fair play to her. And you're right, it was very. I was off that day, but I was still tuning into the debate because I just found it so interesting the way that it was conducted. Fair play to the MPs as well.
Yeah, a good day for Parliament, I think, regardless of what you think of the result. I think that was a moment of MPs really taking their responsibilities seriously and, showing up in a way that you can look at and be like, that's a credit to, So that's my moment of the week. What's yours?
Well, it's got to be the collapse of the French government.
Oh, God.
What is the French word for Schadenfreude? So just to, for what it's worth, I do think, as much as I love our jobs, I do think that France and South Korea have been slightly more interesting politically this week.
It's been quite a week.
So to contextualise what's happened, of course, the French elections were not too long ago, and the hard right and the hard left did very, very well. Of course, Marine Le Pen just blocked from forming a government in the second round as sort of parties coalesced and sort of did deals to stand down and make sure that the Front National, although they've changed their name now, haven't they? But they didn't win. So Macron had a very difficult job, and he chose Michel Barnier as his prime minister, who, of course, Express readers have very, very fond memories of from the Brexit negotiations he was the bogeyman of Brexit, the man who detests Brexit and everything it stands for. So he became prime minister, and he tried forcing through a budget, which was, it made Rachel Reeves's budget look like a land of milk and honey. It was sort of, they were trying to get, they're sort of double the EU limit on deficit at the moment. So billions of tax rises, billions of cuts. And the hard left and the hard right said no. So they did a vote of no confidence. First prime minister ousted in a vote of no confidence since the late 1960s. One of the shortest reigning prime ministers ever. The story gets better and better. Marc Francois was on television last night, and he just responded, "C'est la vie." So the Brexiteers are loving this. I am as well.
A Labour source texted me last night with that Mark Francois being like, how Brexity is it really to be like mangling Franglais on this? Bit gleeful, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's certainly going to be an interesting one for us to watch.
It is. I've got, what comes next, significantly less entertaining. But for the moment, Barnier, politics is difficult. And, ironically, it makes Boris look like a fantastic premier.
This has been The Division Bell. Thanks for listening. If you want to get involved with the poll next week, you can follow us on social. I'm Lizzy Buchan, political editor of the Daily Mirror.
And I'm Christian Calgie of the Daily Express.